Hello, this is Coding Gicha for full-stack developers. So far I've explained how to install and service Apache and PHP modules on a Windows environment. However, this differs from the development workspace path and doesn't quite fit with iDevelopment. Let's set up a PHP development environment using Visual Studio Code as an IDE. When developing web applications, localhost is often used as a URL address. However, if you're developing multiple web applications, you have to edit the web document root directory each time you develop. This also means you can only run one web application at a time. Of course, if you're developing with a separate web application server, like Java, you only need to run one web application, so localhost is fine. However, if you're developing with PHP, registering a development host makes development much easier. To distinguish it from the production host, the host in the development environment will be named with -dev appended to it. Currently, the host of the www secondary domain and the host of the gurum secondary domain are registered in the gicha.org domain. Apache HTTP server for Windows is installed by unpacking, so the web document management directory is included in the Apache home directory. However, this is not a good directory structure. Separating the web document management directory from the Apache home directory provides greater flexibility, facilitates migration to other web servers, and facilitates backup management. In a development environment, it's common to manage files under the development user's home directory. I prefer to manage development-related files under the dev directory. Most operating systems display the user's home directory abbreviated with a tilde, but Windows unnecessarily displays the full path, making the path considerably longer. Furthermore, Windows is less strict with user permissions, so there are no permissions restrictions even in paths directly under the C drive. Therefore, creating the dev directory directly under the C drive can be more convenient. I'll create development-related directories, such as workspaces, under the dev directory. I'll also configure the workspace directory to allow multiple workspaces. Projects covered in Coding Gicha will be grouped and managed under the Codings directory. If you are using a host other than localhost for PHP development, it is more intuitive to use the host name as the project name. PHP doesn't require compilation, making development lightweight. Therefore, a structure with the primary domain as the project and secondary domains as subdirectories won't be too heavy. Since PHP doesn't require compilation, there's no need to separate the source directory. However, to separate test and implementation sources, I'll create a web apps directory under the src directory. It's also a good idea to manage various meeting and design documents together under the project directory, rather than separately. Under the src/web apps directory, I'll develop hosts corresponding to the www secondary domain and the gurum secondary domain. I'll modify the Apache virtual host configuration file to suit the development environment. Apache for Windows doesn't have separate files for each host, but configures all hosts in a single httpd-vhosts.conf file, so I will separate the host with comments. I'll modify the web document root directory of the gurum.gicha.org host to suit the development environment. I'm also planning to make a video that implements the source code of gurum.gicha.org, which is currently in service, so I'll leave only the basic settings and remove any additional settings. For a production server, it's best to separate the log files by host for easy analysis. However, in a development environment, developers are the only users accessing the server, so logs from other hosts won't be mixed in with the development host. To reduce the hassle of modifying the log file to suit your development environment in the log viewer, it is recommended to set it as the default log file. I'll also remove the extension-based MVC pattern configuration. Based on the kurum.gicha.org host configuration, I'll configure the www.gicha.org host configuration. I'll change the server name to the www secondary domain. The primary domain is typically served the same way as the www secondary domain. I'll configure a server alias. I'll modify the web document root directory of the www secondary domain to suit the development environment. I'll also configure the default 80 protocol with the same server name and server alias as the 443 security protocol. Even if the www secondary domain and primary domain are served identically, sessions will differ due to different hosts. This means that if you log in or configure the www secondary domain, this information will not be reflected in the primary domain. To prevent session differences depending on the host, you can forward requests to the primary domain to the www secondary domain. Ultimately, all forward to the www secondary domain, so requests made using the default AT protocol will be redirected directly to the www secondary domain. I'll also configure requests made using the secure 443 protocol to be forwarded to the www secondary domain if the host is the primary domain. I'll restart the Apache HTTP server service. It took some time to set up the development environment. Now, let's cover how to implement a web application with PHP in Visual Studio Code. Let's load the gicha.org project folder. Check Trust for the parent folder to be used as the workspace and agree to the trust agreement. Currently, there's only one project called gicha.org, but I'll be adding more projects as I develop, so let's save it as a workspace. The gicha.org project was the root folder, but now that the Codings workspace has become the root folder, the gicha.org project should appear under it, but it doesn't appear immediately. Collapse and expand the workspace root folder to see the project folder. Let's create a simple PHP example file that outputs the date to the www secondary domain. PHP syntax is written between opening angle bracket $PHP and closing angle bracket. If you are not using an HTML template and are only using PHP syntax, the closing angle bracket can be omitted. Let's write an example that localizes and outputs a date based on the locale and time zone. Here, I declared the locale and time zone as variables. However, if you pass them as parameters and process them according to the client environment, you can output a more user-friendly format. I'll store various date formats in a timestamp. PHP's date format doesn't support locale, but the International Date Formatter object is a new object that allows for locale-based internationalized date formatting and parsing. The International Date Formatter object requires the international extension. While PHP uses standard PHP patterns for date formatting, the International Date Formatter object also allows for the use of ICU patterns. I'll call a PHP page using a web browser. I'll request the page from the primary domain. As configured, it's successfully forwarded to the www secondary domain. However, instead of displaying the date, an error is displayed on the screen. As mentioned earlier, this is because the international extension isn't enabled. Errors displayed on the screen expose the server environment to the user. Furthermore, the absolute path to the PHP file is also exposed. While this may not matter in a development environment, it's recommended to suppress errors in production environments. Open the php.ini file. Change display errors to off. Restart the Apache HTTP server service. Errors are also logged to a log file, so you can use the tail command, which displays newly added lines in real time, to immediately check for errors while developing. Unfortunately, Windows doesn't provide the tail command. While tail is ported to Windows, it's not interactive. Therefore, rather than installing a separate tail, I recommend installing the Log Viewer extension for Visual Studio Code. Let's set up the Log Viewer watch. Set the title to something that clearly indicates that it's a PHP log. Apache integrates PHP as an Apache module, so you need to check the Apache log. Click the log viewer in the activity bar on the left to display the configured PHP log in the list. Double-clicking it will display the log in real time. It's useful to view the log while working on the source code, so it would be ideal to display it in the panel area at the bottom, alongside the source code in the editor area. Let's move the log to the bottom of the editor area. Let's reduce the height of the log area to display more of the source code. Since interactive actions can't be entered in the log results, the currently displayed log is difficult to distinguish from previous logs. However, a buffer is created at the bottom equal to the screen height. By scrolling the log and bringing the last line to the top, you can distinguish between previous logs. Let's refresh the page without fixing the error. Sensitive error information is no longer displayed on the page, and errors can now be viewed in real time using the log viewer. Now, let's enable the international extension to prevent errors. Let's uncomment the international extension. Let's restart the Apache HTTP server service. Let's refresh the web page. The data is now displayed correctly in various formats without errors. While viewing the PHP error log can be useful for development, using Xdebug makes debugging PHP development even more convenient. Next time I'll cover installing Xdebug and enabling debugging in Visual Studio Code. Thank you for watching.